What makes Dagestani fighters so strong? What is it about that region that can create fighters such as Khabib or Islam Makhachev? Well, let's find out. Hello, I'm Meisam, and welcome back to MMA Dive. Now, a question that's consistently posited and asked by friends and family alike is that what is it about Khabib and Islam Makhachev that makes them so prolific in mixed martial arts? Clearly, they have a very high level of skill, particularly when it comes to wrestling. But is there more to this? After all, wrestling is considered to be one of the most popular, oldest, and widely practiced sports in the world today. But strong wrestling alone cannot explain why Dagestani specifically seem to have a disproportionate level of representation in mixed martial arts. Before we can dive into that, we need to understand the cultural and social circumstances that have nurtured these incredible fighters and athletes. Dagestan, as I'm sure many of you already know, is located in southern Russia, west of the Caspian Sea, and it's a land known for its rugged mountains, fertile valleys, and numerous ethnic groups. I sound like a travel guide, but you have to understand the nature of where they live to understand why they're so good at what they do. Dagestan shares borders with several regions and territories, most notably Chechnya to the west, Azerbaijan to the south, and Georgia to the southwest. The region as a whole is referred to as the Caucasus, and despite being linguistically and religiously diverse, share some type of culture between all three countries. Now, the types of things that they share are things like the Lezgi dance, which is performed from everybody from the Azeris of Iran to the Chechens and to the Circassians in the northern Caucasus. Whoo-wee! That's a lot of interesting history. A lot of fancy words. And yes, I am very tired. Now, historically speaking, two significant events within the last 1,000 plus years arguably play the most significant role in Dagestan's history, and by extension, its growth as a major force in the modern world of sports. These are the introduction of Islam and its absorption into the Russian Empire. In the 7th and 8th century, Islam was introduced through Arab and Muslim travelers and merchants who used designated trade routes, specifically the Silk Road. The famous network of roads and routes facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas amongst many different cultures. Imagine a highway, if you will, connected between all these different regions and cultures. Now, this allowed merchants and missionaries to disseminate Islamic teachings to local populations. As with many other regions, the Islamic religion gained ground slowly but incrementally and often appealed to people who stood to benefit from its monotheistic conception of equality. Now, Dagestan was once a frontier region between the Ottoman and Persian empires. In the 19th century, however, the emerging Russian Empire would be the last to claim the territory. In fact, as a result of this territory that was claimed, Dagestan was involved in a war called the Caucasian War between 1817 to 1865. To be clear, when I say Caucasian War, I'm not referring to a conflict between white people. Now, before I continue any further, I'd like to point out that a lot of the information that we're presenting you here today is a bit dry, but let's be frank, a lot of the content you hear about the nature of Dagestani fighters on YouTube is a bunch of gobbledygook. Our goal here at MMA Dive is once again to teach you and for you to learn something of value. That's right, use the noggin. During that time, the foremost political, military, and spiritual leader in Dagestan was a man by the name of Imam Shamil. Dagestani MMA fighters revere Shamil, and yes, one of them is actually named after them because he represents Islamic Sufi notions of honor and chivalry. And yes, I get the inherent contradiction because even the Dagestani fighters who proudly represent Russia respect Shamil, a man who technically fought Russia to maintain independence. But hey man, that's just a part of the idiosyncrasies of national symbols and mythologies. Russian rule has its ups and downs, starting from its inclusion in the 19th century as part of Terek Oblast, a province of the North Caucasian Federal District, to the Soviet era where there were attempts to secularize society and discourage religious practices, to finally the post-Soviet era where Dagestan became the Russian Federation's southernmost republic. Now, during each of these time periods, Dagestan experienced varying levels of political, social, and economic instability, which also led to ethnic and religious tensions. Now, one of the most important events for the purposes of our discussion was the development of Sambo, which stands for, and I have it written here, Samozashita bez Orusia. Haha! I did it. That took 15 takes. Sambo was developed in the early 1920s by the Soviet Red Army, and its founding figures were Viktor Spiridonov and Vasily Oshchepkov, the latter of whom was influenced heavily by his time in Japan, where he trained judo in the Kodokan. In fact, Sambo's judo roots are evident even today, and the Sambo community does not shy away from it, surprisingly. However, in the 1930s, when Soviet-Japanese relationships deteriorated, Oshchepkov was arrested on suspicion of being a Japanese spy. The broader impact of these deteriorated relations was felt in the development of Sambo, which tried to distance itself from its judo roots. Instead, it was emphasized that Sambo is a martial art deriving its techniques from all the Soviet republics. And this is where Sambo began to become more than a martial art. It became a part of a sport that was taught for defense to the soldiers, and then slowly, little by little, became a part of the culture and identity of the Caucasus region. So how does this all relate to the emergence of today's Dagestani MMA stars? Well, the answer is simple but layered. We briefly discussed the region's Islamic history. However, what's rarely discussed is that Islam played a fairly significant role in influencing the world of wrestling. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad himself recommended to his followers to engage in the sport, as he himself engaged in it as well. The Islamic religion considers wrestling to be a great sport that balanced strength, speed, and technique. For example, in some Islamic countries, namely in Iran and the Persian world, wrestling is coupled with religious, spiritual, and ritualistic practices. Now, this is not akin to Dagestan necessarily, but it gives you an understanding of how the Islamic world worked. So much like Eastern martial arts, the sport and the ritual merged into one. This sport in Iran, for example, is known as Varzish Bostani, which is also translated as the ancient sport, or Varzish Zurkhanei, also known as the sport of strength. Now, the house of strength, or the sport of strength, or Zurkhaneh, is the gym in which this sport is practiced. It includes, amongst many other things, wrestling, traditional style weightlifting, and coordinated calisthenics. Now, once again, this may not seem relevant to Dagestan, but what's important here is that wrestling is an inexplicable element of many Islamic cultures. Now, the religion of Islam had a direct impact on the nature and the culture of Dagestan sports and athletics. This incorporated tradition and culture embodied a sense of strength, chivalry, and honor, as I mentioned before. What the fuck is honor? Them Dagestani blokes are all on performance-enhancing drugs. Me? I'm all natural, can't you tell? In this video, we haven't covered the Chechen-Russian conflict, which directly relates to some of the challenges faced by Dagestan as well as its use of wrestling, an attempt to pull away from the conflict. Now, our goal is not to spread propaganda, but to explain the natural nature and behavior of MMA from a fundamental standpoint, as opposed to its growth during turbulent times. In fact, there are a lot of similarities between Chechens and Dagestanis in regards to how they perceive their faith and background in relation to upbringing. Khamzat Chimaev, anyone? If you recall in some of those videos, Khamzat and Khabib's friends and family are very close. The people of the Chechnya and the Ingushetia region collectively refer to themselves as Vainakh, our people, considering their nations to technically be one. This sentiment often applies not just to Chechens and Ingush, but also to the people of the Russian Caucasus as well. That being said, we can clearly see that within the culture of Dagestan, it was encouraged for all youth to be involved in wrestling as a way to stay active and promote their culture. For example, Russia and neighboring countries, including Iran, were aggressively participating and dominating this sport to encourage its visibility as strong nations undeterred by political conflicts and geopolitical movements. There you have it, folks. Dagestan for the win, and a culture that has not been seen in quite some time. Now, I look forward to hearing about your comments and opinions in the section below, and until next time, peace.